do you think you understand what we talk about when we talk about domestic violence? And I explained coercive control to him and he was really gobsmacked and he was like, oh my God, I think I know someone going through that right now. And I'm like, yes, you do, son. But it is like this big light bulb going off for people because they actually do recognize those behaviours and it's not something so othered as physical violence.
This is Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children, and I'm your host, Jane Gilmore. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording, the Wurundjeri people, and recognise that words alone are not enough to close the gap caused by invasion and colonisation. I ask you to join me in action as well as words in acknowledging this by doing things like giving to Aboriginal legal services, or if you can't do that, reading, listening, or watching art, analysis and research produced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This podcast is a series of 6 episodes loosely based on my book, Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children. You don't need to read the book to listen to the podcast, although of course I would be thrilled if you did buy the book. If you're in Australia, I'd love it if you could buy it directly from my website, janegilmore.com, links in the show notes, because that helps me keep the lights on, but you can also get it at any online bookseller. For the book, I rewrote from a feminist perspective 5 traditional fairy tales: Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, The Little Mermaid, and Beauty and the Beast. When I was writing the book, it became very clear that there were dominant themes in each of those 5 stories. Welcome to episode 5, which is about Beauty and the Beast and that tale as old as time, coercive control. The Beauty and the Beast story, first published in the 17th century in France, is a direct descendant of the ancient Greek myth Cupid and Psyche, which was first written down by Apuleius, a 2nd century African-born writer and philosopher. It almost certainly has origins in oral storytelling traditions that go back even further, and variations of the story have appeared in most cultures around the world, such as the woman who married a snake in Indian folklore, the Chinese fairy serpent, and Russia's the scarlet flower. They all tell the story of a father who steals from a beast-like man who then threatens, bribes, or blackmails the man into paying for his crime by giving up his youngest daughter. Most variations of the story also include older sisters who are selfish, bold, or ambitious and therefore cannot find a husband. The youngest daughter is sweet and submissive and hardworking, and she unhesitatingly agrees to marriage with the beast to save her father from the consequences of his theft. The beast, of course, is actually a handsome prince, but he was cursed by a wicked witch to be ugly, violent, and terrifying. It's not his fault, an evil woman made him do it. He yells at the sweet young girl. In some versions of the story, he beats her. In others, he smashes furniture around her. And in every version of the story, he is angry, violent, and intimidating, while she is gentle, submissive, and unselfish. In the French version, the beast attempts suicide because Beauty goes to visit her family. This is how she realises how much he loves her and what a truly good man was hiding under the weight of that violent, frightening exterior. She falls in love with him, breaking the wicked witch's curse. The beast is revealed to be a handsome prince and they live happily ever after. This story has been teaching little girls throughout history and all over the world that if you just love a terrifying man enough, he will transform into the handsome prince of your dreams. If he continues to be the violent beast, it's your fault. You haven't loved him enough, or you have been too selfish to break the curse put on him by a wicked witch. Try harder. This story is not something from the misty past. We're recording this in October, funnily enough on the very day the Beauty and the Beast musical premieres in Melbourne. Around 30,000 people will watch it between now and Christmas. Beauty and the Beast is very much part of our present. My guest for this episode is Jess Hill, author of the award-winning book See What You Made Me Do, which redefined how we think and talk about domestic violence and coercive control. Welcome, Jess, and thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Jane.
So the first thing maybe that we should do is just talk about what coercive control actually is. How do we explain that to people?
Yeah, well, I wanted to go back to just hearing that intro and reading your rewrite of the Beauty and the Beast parable or story really brought to mind one victim survivor who is from Victoria and is probably one of the most strategic and effective reform advocates I've ever met. A true emblem of speaking truth to power. So absolutely no shrinking violet. And the experience she went through with her former partner, who was a serving police officer at the time, was one of the most violent and extreme stories of coercive control I've ever heard. And she told me that she had a safety plan for her 2 children, but no safety plan for herself because she expected to be murdered by him, and that if she was, it would be her fault for not having attended to his PTSD properly. And it just is so emblematic of what you're saying about women learning both through social learning and then through the learning that is, taught to them by the perpetrator, that this is entirely your fault. If you had only made one more compromise or loved me better, I wouldn't treat you like this. I wouldn't be so miserable. And so there is, every time you think you've done enough, the goalpost shifts. And the point is there is never enough. The goalpost will always shift.
It's always women's responsibility to manage men's emotions. Men are never responsible for that because their emotions are always caused by women and alleviated by women. They have no responsibility in it themselves.
Yeah, and women are a convenient place to displace those feelings of shame, unworthiness, all the things that a lot of these men will cover over with grandiosity and entitlement.
Yeah. So explain how that manifests itself in a coercive controlling relationship.
Well, and, acknowledging obviously that every coercive control relationship looks different. It's like bespoke furniture. You can have 1,000 chairs. You sit in the chair and the chairs don't feel so different, but they look quite different depending on what you've ordered.
That's a great analogy.
So, coercive control, I think what is shocking about it, as victim survivors start to understand what they've endured, it really is like unpeeling this onion, and often an onion they didn't even know was there. Like they didn't even know there was like maybe more than one layer to it. And I think what really is very confronting is the idea that it is so similar for so many women, like millions of women across the world, that it's so similar that once you've heard these stories a few times, you can pretty much finish the next person's story before they're halfway through telling it, or at least say, and let me guess, then next he did this, and then next he did that. Essentially, the way that coercive control starts is always through the establishment of trust. And that's true whether we're talking about coercive control in an intimate relationship, whether we're talking about coercive control as it's used in cults. In fact, the very term love bombing came from the 1970s, and it came from a cult context, which was the idea that the followers of the cult and the cult leaders would love bomb the people that they were trying to recruit and would make them feel like this is their new family, their old family is to be left behind. And so this sense of being loved bombed, as we hear about so often in intimate relationships, it sets up this whole idea that you are the most known, the most loved, and the most respected you've ever been by this person. In some relationships, it will also set up the idea that you are much better than all his crazy exes. So there's this, feeling like, yeah, I am better than all those other girls, which is another theme that comes through so strongly in your rewriting of that Beauty and the Beast tale. And there's an ego boost to that, but there's also a bonding that comes through that. Like we are the best for each other and much better than everybody else. So that establishment of trust is really key. And that's why coercive control is so damaging and so disorienting, because this person who knows you better and loves you better than anyone you've ever known, as they start to isolate, degrade and humiliate, and, as time goes on, use more and more sort of tactics and techniques of abuse against you, that belief that it must be your fault because this person knows you better than anyone else becomes so ingrained, because, the sorts of things that coercive controllers will use to get under their target's skin are things like, telling them, well, you've really changed. And what have they changed? Probably what they've changed is that they need some compromise in the relationship, or they would like to, have a debate about something, in terms of how they raise the children, or they want you to wash up or something like that. And you're out of this like fantasy first stage. So once that idealization stage is over, it's like the devaluation process begins.
But they always use that first stage, that love bombing stage, as a weapon against you. This is always the thing you're trying to get back to. Remember when we were so good together. Remember when you loved me properly. Remember when we were so happy. Why can't we be like that anymore? Why won't you let us be like that anymore? So that love bombing stage has a number of different purposes.
Definitely.
But it also remains the thing that we could be back to that if it wasn't for you.
And it's fundamentally immature, right? Like it's like saying we could be back to how the kind of sex that we had on our first date, and we can have that for 20 years. You know, like it's so immature in terms of how relationships work, aside from everything else that's bad about being a coercive controller. And but I think then, you know, Jane Monckton Smith, who's that forensic criminologist from the UK, former police officer and now, you know, author of the homicide timeline, looks at those 8 stages of coercive control primarily that then are predictable, you know, stages that lead to homicide. And she talks about the fact that, you know, controlling people when they are rushing towards some type of commitment in that early stage, which might be just like saying I love you really early, it might be moving in, it might be falling pregnant, it might be getting married within the first 3 months, whatever it is, it's like the controlling person now has a contract that gives them rights and the other person responsibilities. And from that point on, there's no equality to that, you know, the expectation of what will be served in that relationship. And then what I think is truly bizarre in terms of thinking, where does this come from in human nature? How do people know how to replicate this model of coercive control over and over when they're not taught by, you know, Reddit forums, or I mean, some of them are, but like most of them are not. And so why do they know to use these techniques? And the techniques are generally isolation, which can be overt, like if you go to your mother's house, I'll kill you the cat. Or it can be like every time you want to go out, oh, they suddenly need to have a deep meaningful with you, or they're so upset when you come back and they're so stressed out by the fact that you went out without them that you just stop accepting social invitations. And all of these tactics and techniques are happening at the same time. Like it's a system. Sometimes you'll see just a few of them emerge, and they may not emerge for years. They may not emerge until the day you fall pregnant or the day you give birth, that like activates some latent need for control and the need to displace their own feelings of inadequacy onto you. You know, there might be some trigger for that then literally has these guys turn on a dime. So, you know, isolation, degradation, which can be, you know, extreme levels, like we've seen women being forced to eat from the floor or eat from, you know, dog bowls. There's extreme levels of degradation. There can be sexual degradation, but it can be just those like humiliating comments that you're supposed to just giggle along with, especially when they're said in front of your family and friends, like, oh, he's just having a joke. What a raconteur, having, you know, fun at my expense.
And they can also be used together too, can't they? That I know with that isolation and the degradation, that the combination of those two things. So one woman I talked to, I remember she told me every time she went out, he would always want to go with her. Oh, no, we should go together. You know, we're so good together. It's great for people to see that. And then he would tell her afterwards what a fool she'd made of herself. Did you see the way people were looking at you when you said that? Did you see, you know, you made that joke and nobody laughed. You really shouldn't talk like that. So he made her smaller and smaller and smaller in front of everybody she knew until she got to the point where she felt like everybody who loved her didn't like her, and she didn't want to see them because 100%. He had told her that they didn't like her. So it was a combination of degradation and isolation in one little game that he disguised as throwaway lines, jokes, not that big a deal. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? I just said that they didn't laugh at the joke. You shouldn't make jokes like that. You know, it's not that big a deal.
Yeah, I'm trying to help you.
Yeah.
And so much of this is I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to help you have better friendships. I'm trying to help you be a better partner. Again, you know, coercive control makes itself invisible. I think in the book I described it as something like, you know, it's like this sleight of hand trick where constantly your perception of what's going on is being manipulated. And that's actually one of the techniques of coercive control, is to monopolize the perception. So doing exactly that, say like, you know, oh, didn't you see the way they reacted when you said that? Like, you know, you shouldn't wear skirts that short when you go out because everyone thinks you're a slut, all these things. But also this idea that there's something internally wrong with you that is creating this disturbance or the problems in our relationship. You need to figure out either what that is and fix it, or you need to help me fix whatever problems I have. Whatever it is, you need to find a way to fix things. You probably, and me as the perpetrator. And essentially what starts to happen over time is that you're so fixated on what you need to fix that you stop seeing it for a time as a type of abuse, and you start seeing it as the consequence of your behavior or your inability to fix things. And the result of that over time and of all the techniques sort of put together is what Lisa Aronson Fontes in the States calls perspecticide, which is like literally the killing off of your perspective to the point where it's not even, I mean, sometimes you will literally have his words in your head when you wake up in the morning. You'll have his words in your head when you look in the mirror. They'll be in your head when you're thinking about, what do I cook for dinner tonight? Or should I go for that job? Should I accept that social invitation? But it's more just that the spectre of his opinion of you occupies your head and can end up sort of dictating your worldview, which fundamentally limits your options and the sorts of people that you might say, well, I'm going to stay away from my friends because they must really hate me, because that's what you're seeing reflected from your partner all the time. And I think that monopolizing of perception, that fixing the target inwards, looking inwards on their own predicament and how they should change, that is so fundamental to coercive control, because it's all about shutting off your ability to see what's happening to you. And then, of course, you have other things like demonstrating omnipotence. So, the perpetrator kind of creating this almost like godlike presence in the sense that he seems to know everything, in advance. Now, often that was sort of done through either, gaslighting, like pre-tech. It was sort of done through gaslighting or spying in sort of more analog ways. But now, increasingly it's being done through actual surveillance apps, whether it be GPS in the car or secret tracking devices on the phone. And that's what we see from the personal safety survey. The number of women who are being tracked, who know they are being tracked by an ex-partner, has just shot up exponentially. I think from one safety survey to the next, which is, I don't know, is about 5 years, it had gone up by about 200,000.
Yeah, I know when I was working in domestic violence crisis response that you'd go into the refuges and they would be finding trackers in children's teddy bears in the heel of their shoe. They would be finding, going through the phone and going, this has been cloned 3 times. So he's not just got one copy of your phone seeing every text, every email, every message. He's got 3 copies in case he loses one. And this was used to, even 5 years ago, used to happen occasionally.
Yeah.
And now it's all of them.
Yeah.
It's a rare woman that doesn't go into a refuge where they don't find some form of tracking, and often concentrated on the children. So you can check your own stuff and you can check the heel of your own shoes and maybe even have someone check your car. But did you think to check the children's school shoes?
Yeah. I mean, it's diabolical. And I guess when you can have, say, an app that's put on the phone, and most partners are going to know your password. You don't need to be abused. I know my partner's phone password, that's just part of living together. I've got to pay his bills sometimes. So it's not hard to install a secret recording app on your partner's phone, and it's so cheap. And the fact is that they can then activate those devices as a listening device. So you literally have, women having reported back by their partners things that they've said in secret to someone else, and to the point where you're never, very rarely, unless you're really across this and maybe you work in the sector and this is happening to you, but unless that's your background, the first thing you think isn't, oh, he's tracking me. The first thing, especially when it's coming in amongst all the other things that are happening to you, is just, there's no way for me to have a private thought. He seems to just know everything that I think and say in a way that is inexplicable. So it's part of your brain just struggling so much to just deal with the implausibility of what is happening to you. That's what grows and grows as the web of coercive control gets tighter and tighter. It's like this implausible story that even you find hard to believe that this stuff is happening. So how are you going to explain it to someone? I think then the setting of arbitrary rules is really, again, part of this whole thought reform process. It's like, I'm going to train you into compliance, and the point is not that you need to remember to draw the blinds every afternoon at 3 p.m. as one guy did for this woman who was a qualified doctor. The point is that you need to know that rule, but you also need to know the next rule before I insist on it. Again, you need to have my worldview in your head so that you can anticipate my next demand before I punish you for failing to meet it. And Evan Stark, the great Evan Stark, said coercive control is essentially the perpetrator establishing in the mind of their victim the price of their resistance.
Yes.
So it's about setting consequences.
And it's so common too in the women that I've talked to, I'm sure you've had this experience too, where the rules were set about seemingly trivial things. So one woman I talked to, she would be punished if she wore anything that was blue.
Okay.
And then he would redefine what was blue. That's a greenish blue, you've broken the rules. Or it would be the kind of bread that you buy or how much milk you pour into a glass for the children. It was concentrated on small things, and it was done deliberately so that you can't call someone and say, oh my God, what am I going to do? I wore a blue top today.
Yep.
Because you just sound ridiculous.
It's stupid.
Yeah.
But, I remember that from I was doing used to do Bikram yoga before realizing what a horror show Bikram is. Anyway, and now confirmed. And I remember one class, and he was coming to Australia, and the teacher was saying, now everybody remember Bikram really doesn't like green. So don't wear green. And, in that sort of hot and sweaty atmosphere where there's a lot of respect paid to this man, it's like, okay, got it. Don't wear green. And it's amazing how just quickly a group will be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Don't wear green. Like, he hates green. I shouldn't wear green. And obviously a relationship is different to a yoga instructor of worldwide renown. But it's often those little things where you're just like, okay, no big deal. I don't have to wear blue. That's a pretty easy compromise to make, right? But the point is not that you're making that compromise. The point is that that's just one of many compromises that will be expected of you, and there will never be enough. And the point is that they need to be able to see that you will constantly go along with what they're asking you to do. And loyalty and compliance is being actually trained into you. And the biggest thing you have to be compliant in is A, not telling anyone what's happening at home, and B, not even making it visible to him.
Yes.
So don't make your pain visible to him. Don't make his abuse visible to him. It has to be kept a secret within the relationship, within the family. And, part of how you keep that secret is by pretending that it's all the targeted person's fault. And then the secret can be kept by saying, well, she's really quite depressed and anxious. She's got a substance abuse problem, all those sorts of things. But I think one of the parts of coercive control that is key and is probably one of the most dangerous because it's not classified as a type of abuse. And it's sort of what used to be shown on that cycle of violence, where there'd be like the build up, then the explosion, then the honeymoon period, which of course doesn't happen to everyone. But that sort of honeymoon period or the remorse or the apology or just the good time that happens at some points, that's that possibility of hope being laid in front of you that actually it is possible to go back to that beautiful stage that we started with. And that's where you start to, maybe you get back together after you've been apart because they're showing all the signs that you'd worked so hard for. They actually seem to be taking responsibility or lots of different things, which means you may do things like share text messages with them that seem to show like a lot of love and affection, even erotic photographs or things that were you to later show up in family court or, laying charges. It's like, well, hang on, how could she have sent that, just months after all of this is supposed to have occurred?
Yeah.
Or just days afterwards. It's also really intrinsic to the process of gaslighting. And one survivor I spoke to who was very early in my sort of journey of understanding what coercive control looks like, Kay Schubach, she would be assaulted really violently by her partner, who was one of those kind of real sociopathic sort of modus operandi guys, just does it over and over to women all over the eastern suburbs of Sydney. So he would violently assault her. And then as she's crying and cowering in her bed, he would come in and his face will have totally changed. and he'll say, "You look so upset. Can I bring you a cup of tea?"
Yeah.
And in that moment, he's establishing himself both as the bringer of like pain greater than she'd ever imagined and the only person who can make her feel better in that moment.
Yeah, I remember talking to someone once who told me that nobody else can understand how awful that relationship was and how much it hurt me apart from him. He's the only
Yeah.
person I can talk to about how much he hurt me who will actually get it. Because in those moments of reconciliation, he will come back and not just apologize, but he will recognize how much he hurt her and he will tell her that. And nobody else has, because she's just talking to them about pouring milk into glasses and what color t-shirt she wears. But he really understands it because he was there for all of it. So in that moment where he recognizes it and apologizes for it, he's making her real again.
Yeah.
Everything he took away from her, her ability, her perspective, her judgment, her faith in herself, her connection to everybody else, by recognizing that in that one moment, he's giving it all back and restoring herself. And nothing feels as good as that. And of course, then he takes it away again. And because he's been taking it away so regularly and so easily in the past, it's very easy for him to do it again very quickly. When they do reconcile, they get back together, he can just flip a switch and suddenly it's all there again, and he can take her back years within minutes.
Yeah.
And trying to explain that in a court is impossible.
Of course.
Well, it's not impossible, but
It's very difficult, right? Unless you've got
Yes.
a judge who's very au fait with the dynamics. And, increasingly we're seeing some pretty complex judgments reflecting a deep understanding of this, but still very patchy, obviously. But I think that it's also that this person who knew her so well and loved her and respected her, who then became so disappointed in her, seemed to hate her, seemed to think she had ruined his life, in a lot of these instances. It's like he's the only one. If he just apologizes properly and says, actually, I was wrong and you are that good person that I fell in love with, that was my fault, then that shame will be taken away. But because that process of perspecticide and having them so strong in the mind, it's like no matter what people say about it not being your fault, and these are all the ways that this happened to you and why and how, they still hold so much power because they're the one who've taken it away. They're the only ones who can give it back in that same sort of vein. It's such a trap, and it can trap people for years, even after the perpetrator is dead. Those people can still be abiding by the same rules or cleaning the house in the same way that they were supposed to while they were alive.
yeah, there's something almost addictive in it.
Yeah.
To me, it's almost a bit like nicotine addiction. I grew up in the 90s. I learned how to smoke. And that being addicted to something that is harming you, that gives you no benefit, but if you stop taking it, you crave it and you can't think of anything else. And even years later, years and years after I gave it up, I know that if I went out right now and bought a packet of cigarettes, it would take me 2 tops. And I'd be back in the habit again, because that neural pathway is just so entrenched, and that feeling of, oh, this feels so good to be so harmed is so ingrained in me that that's just the way my brain works, because nicotine addiction taught me to think like that. And even though I know all the facts now about how bad it is for you, how expensive it is, how disgusting it is, I know all of that. Of course I know all of that. But as I said, I reckon it would take 2 and I would be addicted again.
Yeah, no, totally. So I think that what we were just talking about in terms of how easy it is for a coercive controller to set their target back, months, years, in terms of their ability to see what's going on, to see that they deserve something better. I talk to magistrates when I'm doing judicial education about this in terms of how they think about contact breaches. So if you've got an intervention order or protection order, often police and lawyers, and when there's been a breach, like you weren't supposed to contact that person, but you did, you sent flowers to their workplace or whatever it is, seems really innocuous. And it will often be presented to the courts as this low order or technical breach because it wasn't physically violent, despite the fact that the court has said you cannot contact, and this is the rule that the order has set. And what I say to magistrates is, if you're a victim of coercive control, the only way you can deprogram yourself from the thought reform process that you've been subjected to is space and time. You need space away from that person You need independent space where they cannot contact you, where they cannot draw you back into that way of thinking, so that and that's the only way you start to see yourself as possibly as you were, or start to just get glimmers of what it is that you deserve as a human being with human rights. And obviously accounting for the horrors of misidentification and, when victims can be misidentified on orders and then goaded into breaching, all of that needs to be accounted for. But the basic idea that these low order breaches aren't important, in coercive control, they're extremely important. And those flowers sent to the workplace can be a coded message, which is no judge is going to stop me from accessing you. And that's the message that the perpetrator gets when they say it's just a low order breach, there's no consequence. And it's the message that the victim survivor gets. And the message is, don't even bother trying to get help.
Yeah.
Because this is such a language that you and I only understand. No one will be able to see the harm, no matter how you try to explain it.
Yeah. And then again, trying to explain to a magistrate the harm of, well, he sent me flowers with a 3-word message in the card. And what that told me was that I have to go back to him and back to who I was when I was with him, because there isn't anything else for me and there never will be anything else for me. And if he does it again, I might not be able to defend myself against that, and I might end up back there again. Trying to explain that to a magistrate who's never experienced it or never understood it or never even had somebody explain it to him is almost, it's not impossible, because I know some incredible people who've done it, but I also know some incredible people who haven't been able to do it because they weren't able to put it into words and they couldn't find a way to articulate it and they couldn't find a way to explain it to somebody who had no context to understand it. And often when people have told me that story, that the end of that story is, so I went back to him. But that does actually bring us to an interesting question of using the legal system to hold perpetrators to account, which is one of the things that holding perpetrators to account is in the national plan, which is supposedly how the entire country is working towards eliminating violence against women and children. The legal system seems to be almost the only way that we try and hold perpetrators to account, which I find a bit worrying, because the underlying principle of our legal system is the presumption of innocence, which we cannot mess with. That is the only protection that the legal system offers to people who are disadvantaged by poverty or mental illness or substance abuse, by colonisation and trauma. And we know that the legal system already does a lot of harm to those people, but the only protection they have is the presumption of innocence. And that means that in crimes where you're talking about one person's word against the other, if you presume one person's innocent, then you have to presume the other person's lying, and they have to prove that they're not. So when we're taking these kind of crimes like domestic violence or sexual violence into the legal system, we're taking it in, saying to people who have experienced this kind of violence, the point of this system is to assume that you're lying, prove that you're not. The point of this system is to not send a perpetrator to prison, being the only consequence we can really offer them, unless we can prove that you're not lying. And then if he does go to prison, he might be there for 3 to 6 months. When he comes out, he will be more dangerous than he was when he went in, and there is nothing else that we can do. So I have a lot of issues with the idea of the legal system as a tool to hold perpetrators to account when we don't have enough other means of doing that. We don't have enough ways of protecting women. We don't have enough ways of dealing with the men who use coercive control, and we'll get into why they do it in a bit. But I'm just interested in your perspective on the legal system, because I know you've done a lot of work on what's just recently happened in New South Wales, the criminalising of coercive control, and I can see that there's absolutely good reasons for that. But how does that work for the perpetrators? How do they experience it?
Well, can I complicate that picture slightly?
Because it was pretty simple to start with.
Just bring in perhaps where I slightly differ on that interpretation. So one part of it is, and I think this really came through in the Me Too movement, that when we say believe women, we're not saying believe them just on the basis of what they say. What we're saying is start by believing. So start by taking them seriously, take their allegations seriously enough to investigate them. And the purpose is that if you investigate them and there's no basis to them, well, then okay. But so often what we see in allegations of domestic violence or sexual violence is that police or the courts will just say, well, ipso facto, there's nothing going on here. There's nothing to investigate. Now, when I say there's nothing going on here, there's nothing to investigate, one of the reasons why I and many others were intent on getting law reform on coercive control was to say that if we only look at an incident, then what's going on here is limited to what went on in this 1 minute. You know, did she throw a phone at him? Why did she throw a phone at him? Doesn't really matter because she committed an offense, right? And often, let's say that she threw the phone because she's undergone 5 years of coercive control, or he's made threats against the children, and she's cracked it and decided in a bid to just defend her own dignity, and because she's pissed off, she's thrown a phone at him. Now the police come to the door. Maybe he, maybe she answers. There's only one person talking often in that scenario, and that's her saying, yeah, I fucking threw the phone. Like, you know, he's an asshole and this is what he did. Now, is he saying anything? No, he is not. He is not admitting to 5 years of coercive control. And the point being is that so many women are picked up on charges for acts of self-defense or violent resistance because we have this system that only looks at incidents. So one of the purposes of trying to bring law reform around coercive control was to say, when you see a violent act or you see an act of property damage, that may be the tip of a much greater iceberg. And your job now with these coercive control offences is to investigate whether there is a whole system of coercive control underpinning that. And that's what the Attorney Generals have now, you know, agreed to across the nation, is that coercive control is almost always the dynamic underpinning family violence. So police should presume that when they attend a call out, that just like we presume now within the domestic violence sector that a woman might be being tracked and it's best to look and check rather than presume she's not, now it's incumbent upon police to think a bit deeper about whether this is just the tip of a much greater iceberg. I think in terms of what do laws do? Laws create a sense in society about what is or is not allowed. So say, for example, take the marital rape laws that overturn our friend, the jurist John Hale, his opinion about whether women should owe sex to their husbands. Now, there was lots of opposition to marital rape laws coming into, you know, just the idea that you could be raped in marriage, that it took almost 20 years for the entire country to legislate against that, first in South Australia in the mid-70s and then in Northern Territory last in the early 90s. And the sorts of opposition was things like, it'll be underutilized. How can we be in people's bedrooms? You know, like it's not proper to be inside people's marriages. How would you ever prove this? Now, is it true that it's been underutilized? Yes. Is it true that it's very difficult to prove? Absolutely. Would we go back and reverse it? Would we go back and say we should not have marital rape laws? I don't think any feminist would say, aside from people who are very strict abolitionists who don't believe in having sort of laws at all, I don't think anyone would say we'd be better off with not having marital rape laws, because they set a standard in society about what should be expected within a marriage. Does rape still occur in marriage? Yes, a lot. It's not that it obliterates that behaviour, but it says that that's not acceptable. And we have a red line that you're not supposed to cross. Now, will the consequences be uniform for people who cross it? No, they will not. And I think it's the same with coercive control. Really, what we were trying to establish is, A, we need to say in society that torture of this kind in intimate relationships is not acceptable. And if we just say, well, we have a law against physical assault, but in terms of coercive control, the only way you can get protection there is to get a civil protection order, then we're creating a hierarchy which says physical assault is much worse. And that's just not how victim survivors experience it. So the actual act of having these charges brought to court is one part of having this law. And obviously it's an important part, but it's not the only part. A part of it is setting a standard in society. And also there is nothing like introducing a law to convince people from all professionals from all sorts of sectors that they have to be educated on what this law is about. So the implementation task force in New South Wales that has been built around these laws, I don't know any other law that has had so much infrastructure built around it to make sure that it was implemented responsibly. There's like 10 groups that cover LGBTQI, lived experience, First Nations. There's marketing campaigns in multiple languages, marketing campaigns developed by First Nations advertising agencies to explain what coercive control is. Every police officer will be trained in it in New South Wales, not just those who are going through the academy. There is training across the courts, and hospitals are starting to get more and more trained in this area. Now, I think it's arguable that had there not been a law introduced in New South Wales or some other massive public homicide that led to a royal commission or something, what happened in Victoria, we wouldn't be seeing those sorts of changes occurring. And I think also in terms of what happens to guys who get pulled up on coercive control charges, what happens to men who are convicted of coercive control, well, yes, a prison sentence is one outcome, but actually we also want to see coercive control recognised more readily on protection orders. We want to see it recognised more readily in family law orders. And magistrates still have the option to order diversions. So they can decide that in this case, prison's not appropriate. Like, prison sucks. I would love it for us not to have prisons. Prisons are shitful. We just don't have an alternative right now for literally warehousing humans that just cannot be on the street, for a period of time. But those diversion programs to things like men's behaviour change programs or rehab programs, that's also possible for magistrates to use. And I think it's really important to remember that lots of women won't want to pursue criminal charges. It's just not not important to them. It doesn't feel protective. There's all sorts of reasons why they won't want to do it. The process is too awful to contemplate. But for those who do, and for those who do want a custodial sentence for their perpetrator, sometimes what you hear from these women is that's the only time I had that I could feel safe or that I could rearrange my life, or having that custodial sentence was the evidence I could present to family court to say that he's not a fit parent. I think also that really what we need to do is listen very closely to what victim survivors want and give them, as much as we can, empower them to make the choices that work for them. And sometimes those choices politically won't align with what we would prefer to have happen or what we think is better on a societal-wide level, but having those choices be the best possible choices that we can offer victim survivors, I think that's sort of what's incumbent upon us. And having their experience recognised in totality by a court for women who go through that process is incredibly important.
That's a really interesting perspective of using public structures to change structural problems, because that concept of law reform means all these other areas have to keep up. I noticed the way that happened in Victoria when we brought in affirmative consent laws, and the way the training was given across the board. And in the episode with Lauren French, when we were talking about we should have a nationwide consent training program, it was one of the things that we were talking about. Oh no, we only teach kids.
Wow.
We don't bother teaching adults because, as Lauren said, they're like cakes. They're already baked. They don't need anything else. And that concept that actually, yes, they do. In law reform, we were doing affirmative consent training in a lot of adult places because the assumption was apparently adults might not know that affirmative consent is something that you need when you're going to have sex with someone. Yeah. So it is a structural problem. Coercive control and abusive relationships is a structural problem. You need to use structures to change it. That makes a lot of sense. I think the other thing too that maybe isn't talked about enough is inherent in what you were just saying, that this is really complicated stuff. We're talking about human relationships, which is always complex. And going back to what you were saying at the very beginning, all the different chairs look different. You can't make a blanket rule to solve the problem of what chairs should look like, because everybody's chair is different. Everybody's experience of an abusive relationship is different. Everybody's ability to explain it and articulate it and even understand it themselves so that they can try and tell someone else about it, they're different for every person. So that belief that one law can apply to everything, can fix every problem. We can make this really simple. We actually can't. We can recognise its complexity and adapt to complex solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's why the coercive control laws also did not have a prescriptive list of behaviours. They have a guidance list of behaviours. It's like things like isolation and all the things that we discussed at the top of the episode, and being able to prove that there is a system of these behaviours occurring, that it's not just one, oh, she's emotionally abusive, or she doesn't let me pay the bills, or whatever. Like, that's not enough to prove a coercive control offence. And really, the way the legislation is designed, I think in every state where it's being introduced, in New South Wales, in Queensland, and where the legislation's been introduced to Parliament in South Australia, is they decided to set the bar quite high at being able to prove intent. So you have to be able to prove that the perpetrator intended to control and dominate. Now, intent can be inferred, of course. It doesn't have to be like, okay, bitch, like if you don't do this, I'm going to kill you. Like, it doesn't have to be, although remarkably common, these like trails of evidence that are left behind. But you don't have to have it that, you can have it inferred like it was quite clear that by saying he didn't want her to go out, or he didn't want her to wear this certain thing, that the inference is that he was intending to trying to control her. But it's setting that bar quite high, improving the intent, rather than going with the lower bar of recklessness, like they were reckless as to whether that behaviour would control and dominate, means that you're going to get, when we see these charges start to come through, and at the moment I think the first 3 months of statistics since the law was operationalised, is it 3 months? Anyway, on the 1st of July in New South Wales, they've shown, first off, 95% of victims are female, which was essentially what we were saying is a bit of a guide. We'd expect to see about like 5 or 6% male victims, against whom may be female or male perpetrators or non-binary perpetrators. But I think when we start to see the convictions come through, that the offences will be particularly heinous. I think that we're going to have a very high bar. They will likely include physical violence, but we are also seeing charges come through where there's no physical violence at all. And that's actually different to what's happened in other countries where these laws have been introduced, where the first few years there really was only sort of coercive control that also included quite sort of serious physical and sexual violence. We're seeing actually cases of coercive control where there isn't physical violence but quite extreme control. So I think, in this country, we've pretty much had since 2020 a national informal campaign to educate the public on coercive control, which was really triggered by the murder of Hannah Clark and her 3 children by Rowan Baxter. Since then, I mean, the amount of media attention on this phenomenon has been, it just went from kind of 0 to 100. Suddenly coercive control is everywhere. It's, the way media reported on domestic violence stopped being about if it bleeds, it leads. It started being about what does the victim survivor say is the most important thing, the most harmful thing to them. Also, what are all these new forms of abuse coming through? Like, new, they're not new, but like, what are these new forms of abuse that we're aware of? Like financial abuse, like tech surveillance, like all these sorts of things. So we're also seeing, when you talk about accountability for perpetrators, I think one part of accountability for perpetrators that's outside of the legal system is where companies that have perpetrators as clients, like banks, for example, cancel their accounts for sending abusive messages along with online transactions, where companies are saying, if you misuse our products, we will penalise you as a customer. And that level of, might seem quite sort of small beer in comparison to a prison sentence, and it is, but that level of accountability which says you can't just weaponise any system you like and think you'll get away with it, that's also really important and is actually potentially more persuasive for some perpetrators, because it's like, well, I can't live my life, I can't access my online bank account if I keep sending her abusive messages through that system. So I'll stop, because I need that.
Yeah. One of the victim survivors I talked to once told me about how just outraged and disbelievingly outraged her partner was when she blocked him from texting her. And so he contacted the phone provider and said, well, this service that I used to be paying for has now blocked me and I want you to unblock it. And the service was Optus or Telstra, one of the big ones, said, well, actually, no, we're not going to do that. And in fact, if your ex-partner needs any help to stop you from contacting her, we'll give it to her. And he was not just enraged by this, but bewildered. How can you're supposed to be on my side? This idea that those structures are supposed to help him, not help her, was so utterly devastating to him, because his belief that he's the victim, which I certainly don't have to tell you, but so many, if not all, perpetrators believe they are the victims. And it's something that I talk about a lot, of the only group of people who actually believe that all men are violent is violent men. It is not feminists, it is not women, it is not even me. It is only violent men who believe that. And they think everybody else, all the other men around them, are like that, and secretly sharing the same ideas, the same beliefs and the same behaviour, and therefore will back each other. So when your mates say, oh no, but he's such a good guy, what they're saying is he's like me. And when Optus or Telstra or one of those phone carriers says, oh yes, of course, if you want to send these messages to your ex-partner, we'll help you do that, because we, being a big patriarchal organisation, agree with what you're doing. And he was horrified, absolutely horrified that this didn't happen. And she said it was one of the most angry he'd ever been. He was more angry about that than he was about convictions in court.
Yeah, totally.
Because he'd come to accept that that was part of it, and it was a woman magistrate anyway, so what do you expect?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what, like, the revolution I think that we've seen in people's understanding of what domestic and family violence actually is, and understanding that underpinning dynamic, has meant that suddenly, where businesses might have thought, oh yeah, we can, offer leave, or we can, try to offer some sort of like extra security for employees experiencing domestic violence, but not thought about the way that their own products could be weaponized by perpetrators and their responsibility to their own clients, because they primarily thought of it as, this is just something that happens behind closed doors. It's primarily physical, and maybe there's some emotional stuff thrown in there. But the idea of how systems are used, which is what's become just reasonably common knowledge over the last 5 years, but was not prior to that, just was not common knowledge. That's a total revolution. Yeah. And I think that really, while we had an absolute nationwide awakening after Luke Batty was murdered and the advocacy of Rosie Batty, and there was so much that got achieved during those 5 years. And then it was like this second phase, which is like, okay, now the nation is ready to look even deeper into what goes on and to understand what the sector means when they talk about power and control. And I think that as we get greater and greater community understanding of this, we'll also start to see a shift in that statistic which says, oh, domestic violence doesn't happen in my neighbourhood. Because when I talk to people in my neighbourhood and, the parents at my kids' school, of course I know every parent who either works in the DV sector, is a victim survivor, or potentially is a perpetrator. So I have this completely different lens on the local environment. But, I've had, one school dad said to me when I told him what I did, he was like, oh, it's such a relief that sort of thing doesn't really happen around here. And I said, yeah, funny you should say that. And just said to him, I said, do you think you understand what we talk about when we talk about domestic violence? And I explained coercive control to him, and he was really gobsmacked, and he was like, oh my God, oh, I think I know someone going through that right now. And I'm like, yes, you do, son. But it is like this big light bulb going off for people, because they actually do recognize those behaviors, and it's not something so othered as physical violence. Now, with that person that he thinks he knows, there actually might be physical violence going on, but that would all be so hidden and so, in most cases, so difficult to see. And that truly is the stuff that happens behind closed doors. But the other stuff actually often happens right in front of people. It's just that people don't know how to read it, or they excuse it at the time. Like, oh, he's just making a joke, or yeah, he's a bit funny. And he sort of has all these like really high expectations of her, or she doesn't seem to come out so much. All these things that get excused, like, oh, there's a reason for that. There's always a reason for that, until you start to see the pattern.
Yeah, and there's also that myth of the monster myth that I think is still quite pervasive of, oh, yes, there are some men who do that, but they're monsters. They're not men like me. They don't look like me. They don't look like my mates or my colleagues or my boss or my son or my brother. They don't look like it's a monster. So if I saw a monster abusing a woman, of course I would say something, but I didn't see that. I saw my brother making a joke with his wife.
Yeah. And that monster myth also, you know, when you don't sort of log into the fact that actually when you've set aside the guys who are like sociopathic, sort of, you know, just purely instrumental about getting their needs met in a way that's like they kind of are so cauterized from their emotional core that emotions just aren't even a factor. When you consider that for the vast majority of these guys using this behavior are like supremely insecure, and, you know, there's always a clue when perpetrators speak. There's always clues in what they're saying. The clue in that thing of like, I'm the real victim here, you know, is they're displacing, you know, their feelings of fear and anger and shame and all the rest of it onto their partner, and then completely misinterpreting the cues from their partner to be attacks or to be infidelity or to be disrespect, all these things. But also, I think the fact is like that belief that they are a real victim, like that's a miserable place to live. Like the idea that you're being victimized by pretty much everyone you choose to bond with or choose to have an intimate relationship with, they always victimize you. That is a miserable way to live. And they may not know any different, you know, because that's how their way of connecting has evolved over time for various reasons. But I think that we underestimate just how miserable it is to be a coercive controller. And obviously there are many, many benefits that come, but in terms of what is an optimal way to live, the idea of like the all-powerful man, like just exerting himself, is also what makes it harder for people to recognize their friends as that person. Because actually a lot of the time there's a lot of anxiety and depression and just general shitfulness for these guys, that if you were to log in a bit more into that insecurity and the reasons they're making these jokes or the reasons why they're stopping her from going out, you'd be able to see them more in their humanity.
Jess, that's so fascinating. I could keep talking to you about this for hours, and it's the perfect time to mention I'm in the process of writing the sequel to the Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children book, which is called Superheroes Can't Save Your Children. And I'm going to have to get you back for that podcast to talk more about what's going on for those men, because that will be exactly on point. And look, I could listen to you talk about this for so much longer, but we're running over time, so I'm going to have to wrap it up. Firstly, I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done and also for giving the time to this. In amongst all the other demands on your time, I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience does as well, because nobody can explain it like you can. Thank you so much.
Oh, Jane, well, thank you. You do so much work on this and get insight at like few other people who write about this subject do. So
we are the dream team between us, aren't we?
Absolutely.
We'll definitely have to get you back for the next one. Thanks again, Jess.
Thanks, Jane.
That was Jess Hill, author of the award-winning book, See What You Made Me Do. Don't forget, if you want to buy the Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children book, you can get it direct from my website if you're in Australia, or from your preferred online bookseller anywhere else. Next week will be the final episode, where we'll be pulling all of these strands together, talking about how they're all connected and what we can do to solve the entire problem in one short, sweet, simple solution. Obviously, I can't do that, so Emily Maguire is going to come in and help us all make the world a better place.
The experience of gender is real for every single human. Even if you're non-binary, you can't escape binary gender. All you've got to do is talk to, you can talk to a 4-year-old boy, you can talk to a 16-year-old boy, you can talk to a 45-year-old man, and they are all going to talk about expectations that look different at all those ages, but they'll tell you what those gender boxes are from a terrifyingly early age.